Do you remember the first time you killed someone?
Yeah.
In the turbulent year of 1968, the conflict in Vietnam witnessed one of the many dark chapters that marked the history of the North American Navy. Many brutal acts, such as the My Lai massacre, to cite an example, were perpetrated by its soldiers. Truly monstrous events happened during this war. The surprising thing was that American morality saw them as an anomaly and not as a common practice. However, evidence has been found to suggest that these types of abhorrent war crimes were the rule rather than the exception. Atrocities committed by the U.S. military appear to have been the norm in the Eastern country. In today's video, we are going to see the terrifying living conditions and traumas that United States troops experienced, and what the subsequent consequences were for those who managed to survive that jungle hell called Vietnam. Get ready for a trip to the most explosive and dangerous jungle of the 20th century, where you not only have to take care of insect bites, but also bullets. Welcome once again to Military History. In the midst of a war where the need to win hearts and minds was often cited, the U.S. military focused almost exclusively on one metric that would define the success of its troops in Vietnam: the body count, i.e., the number of enemies killed in combat. The Vietnamese forces, outgunned and outstrategized by their opponents, relied on tactics that involved mines and other explosive traps, as well as sniper fire and ambushes in the middle of an extremely hostile jungle unknown to the attackers. Their strategy was based on attacking and withdrawing immediately, so as not to give the American soldiers a chance to respond. Faced with the inability to confront an adversary that determined the time and place of the confrontation, American forces immersed themselves in the indiscriminate destruction of forests, villages, and everything that had to do with Asians. The idea was that if the Americans managed to eliminate more of the Viet Cong's enemies than the Vietnamese could replace, the Easterners would naturally give up the fight. In order to encourage troops to obtain high enemy casualties in the Vietnam War, competitions were established between different units to determine who could inflict the most casualties. A macabre game that the lieutenants of the United States Armed Forces promoted in a sinister way in the ranks of their young soldiers. Rewards for greatest achievements were displayed as banners. They were shown on what were known as death boards, which were tables where each unit wrote down their murders. Prizes included days off or an extra case of beer. Cigarettes were also an extremely coveted prize. In parallel, commanders who achieved these goals with their troops could ensure rapid promotion within the military team. Quickly, the slogan, "If he is dead and he is Vietnamese, he is VC," crowned by the acronym with which the Americans called the Viet Cong, this phrase became a characteristic motto of the war, and the bodies of civilians were regularly recorded as enemy or Viet Cong casualties. Ordinary people, including women and children, lost their lives trying to escape from soldiers or helicopter gunships that had fired warning shots, or simply because they were in a village suspected of harboring the enemy. At that time, many of these actions were not reported, but they did not go unnoticed either, as they were encouraged by higher-ups. It should be noted that those who carried out these dark actions were not always really aware of what they were doing. That was because many times they were just young boys who believed they were defending their country. At the crossroads of a destiny marked by war, some American citizens volunteered to embark for Vietnam. However, among the ranks of deployed soldiers, many did not make the decision by choice, but were recruited without the possibility of deferring their service because they were not pursuing a university degree. Most of these young warriors did not question the draft or the legitimacy of the conflict in Vietnam. Inspired by the tradition of their fathers and grandfathers, who had served in various wars for the nation, these fighters felt it was their duty to continue that legacy. the lack of options and patriotic duty pushed them towards the front lines.
Outside of war, is mostly never justified. But in war, neither side deserves to die, honestly. I mean, that guy over on that side is fighting for what he believes in, and you're fighting for what you believe in, and both have families and children probably, and you know.
The fight against communism, one of the central axes of the war, was not questioned by many, since they did not fully understand the dimension of the conflict. Whether facing the Viet Cong or the Russian ballet, they were willing to follow the orders of their government, feeling that they belonged to something greater than themselves and that they must do their duty. Among the probable tasks, the possibility of being assigned to the feared Black Lions Battalion did not deter them either. This unit was a bloodthirsty assault troop to which the Easterners had particular animosity. Its reputation was such that it was said that the Viet Cong offered juicy rewards for each soldier killed in combat by this troop. They even put a price on their bones. However, the idea of danger did not occupy space in the minds of these young people in their 20s. Due to the unconsciousness of youth, they all shared a feeling of invulnerability that drove them to bravely face the unknown. The problem was that the actions they were going to be forced to carry out would leave much more serious consequences than the physical ones, but we will delve into that topic later. On the battlefields of Vietnam, these anonymous young warriors were faced with a series of challenges, as terrible as they were complex for a novice soldier. Gradually brought in as replacements into existing units, they found themselves disconnected, isolated in an environment where the lines between friend and foe were constantly blurring. Everything was hostile. Everything was danger. On more than one occasion, one of the rookie soldiers sensed a threatening presence and shot reflexively, sometimes wounding a comrade and in other cases directly ending his own life.
One minute you have somebody walking along, and next there's just a lump of flesh.
With no geographical boundaries to distinguish between allies and threats, distrust reigned in the hearts of each of the beginners. Seemingly innocent villagers could be civilians or Viet Cong sympathizers, and seemingly safe areas could become dangerous zones in a matter of moments. The frustration of the new arrivals was compounded as they felt that the higher-ups, comfortable in their safe helicopters, were pressuring the soldiers on the ground to move faster and eliminate more enemies. The rivers of blood that ran through the hands of these boys carried a cartridge of guilt that would be fired a long time later. After exhausting days traversing the jungle with backpacks weighing more than 20 kilograms, the soldiers faced the possibility that a general, without understanding the reality of the terrain, would criticize the way in which they had established their perimeter, ignoring the complexities of war, in which they were immersed. These systematic abuses and mistreatment also aggravated the already tiring experience of being at the heart of a murderous war. As if these manic conditions were not enough, in this chaotic scenario, the troops suffered from an extra disadvantage. The rules of war have existed since time immemorial. These are basic codes of coexistence in any conflict, such as not attacking hospitals or civilians who are minors, the elderly, or women. The problem was that they were written in English, and the Viet Cong, called Charlie by the Americans, did not understand or respect these tacit war agreements. For this reason, he acted unpredictably, annihilating those who believed they were in a safe zone or in some type of implicit truce. In the dense confines of the Vietnamese jungle, most American soldiers lived out their year-long tours without witnessing terrifying large-scale battles or facing the dread of an ambush. However, when those times came, the lack of experience and training often proved fatal for dozens of men in a matter of minutes. For Mike Troyer, an interim squad leader in Delta Company, the ambush of October 17, 1967, marked a brutal milestone just 3 months after he arrived in Vietnam. On that fateful day, the difference between shadow and sun determined life or death. Crouching behind an anthill, Troyer sought refuge in the darkness, watching helplessly as the shots hit his most exposed companions until he ended the shooting. Advancing later across the battlefield, his mission became heartbreaking. Find someone alive among the unrecognizable bodies, pierced by projectiles. He could only identify a companion by a tattoo, since his body and face were completely disfigured. The little that remained of those soldiers, abandoned on the ground, became a grim reminder on Vietnamese soil. Their bodies, never recovered, became ghosts that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. These conditions were the perverse breeding ground that generated an outbreak of excessive violence and inhumane actions by young American combatants. Psychologically broken, these boys were willing to do anything to end the war and return home.
It goes from something, a big something, to the smallest nothing that there can be. It goes from dreams and aspirations to nothing. You know, you can kick it, you can hit it with a stick, you can throw rocks on it, you can do anything, and it won't bother it because it's dead.
An intricate web of war crimes research at the U.S. National Archives during a 2001 exploration of post-traumatic stress disorder in Vietnam veterans revealed a treasure trove of reports that had been long buried and forgotten. Silent witnesses to the horrors of the conflict, these boxes housed files from criminal investigations and everyday documents that offered a disturbing insight into the events that occurred during that turbulent period. Among the yellowed pages, some recounted in a vivid and chilling manner the details of atrocities committed, while others only hinted at terrible events that had gone unnoticed. The U.S. military deployed an impressive arsenal of lethal power, destructive force, and advanced technology, surpassing in magnitude any other military in the history of the world. The amount of ammunition fired per soldier was a staggering 26 times greater in Vietnam than during World War II. At the end of the conflict, the United States had dropped the equivalent of 640 atomic bombs on Vietnam, like those it had dropped on Hiroshima, leaving an indelible mark on the history and memory of that nation. These abstract data on paper were deaths carried out, bloody scenes and torture experienced firsthand by the American warriors. Across vast regions, entire villages were targeted by intensive artillery bombardment, devastating airstrikes and helicopter gunship assaults, before ground forces embarked on search and destroy missions to wipe out what remained of the enemy. The command of the superiors was simple, plus, kill everything that moves. The phrase became a directive in the mouths of some American commanders, whose troops carried out massacres in various parts of their area of operations, often against their own will. Plus, women, children, and the elderly, all of them civilians, were the ones who suffered the deadly consequences. As if it were poetic justice, the ghosts of these victims would return to haunt the soldiers, but it is a theme that we will develop later in the video. Although the United States suffered more than 58,000 casualties in the war, it is estimated that approximately 2 million Vietnamese civilians lost their lives, while another 5.3 million were wounded, and around 11 million, according to U.S. government data, were forced to flee, become refugees in their own land. Collective memory often recalls the My Lai massacre in March 1968, where more than 500 civilians were brutally murdered in a span of 4 hours, even as the already dehumanized and cynical U.S. troops took a lunch break. However, it is also imperative to remember equally bloody operations like Speedy Express, which, thanks to cover-up at the highest levels of the U.S. military, remained in the shadows until the beginning of the 21st century. In late 1968, the 9th Infantry Division, under the command of General Julian Ewell, unleashed a large-scale operation in the heart of the Mekong Delta, densely populated southern Vietnam. In a context already obsessed with body counts, Ewell, known as the Butcher of the Delta, stood out even more. He fired subordinates who did not meet the daily kill quota he demanded and unleashed devastating firepower on a region teeming with civilians.
I was down, and all I could see was his head and shoulders. He had a hard hat on, and then I saw the red emblem. It was. And then when I could see a silhouette, I blasted them. Silhouettes. They're not real people, they're just targets.
A brave whistleblower from the division approached the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, William Westmoreland, requesting an urgent investigation. He detailed that the artillery aimed at the villages had taken the lives of women and children. The armed helicopters terrorized the farmers, forcing them to flee, and then massacred them from the air, playing challenges of aim and success. Troops on the ground replicated the brutality, spiraling a whirlwind of violence that seemed to have no end. The result was a series of massacres on an industrial scale, equivalent, in Ewell's words, to 1 My Lai every month. When the operation came to an end, Ewell's division boasted of having annihilated more than 11,000 enemy, but the number of weapons captured was barely more than 750. This showed that, at most, that was the number of Vietnamese that actually represented a threat to Americans. Westmoreland chose to ignore the whistleblower, dismiss any incipient investigation, and conceal the files, although an internal Pentagon report recorded some of the most incriminating accusations. The clandestine investigation into Speedy Express remained classified for decades until it was unearthed at the National Archives. According to military estimates, a minimum of 7,000 confirmed civilians perished during the operation. Even more revealing, the analysis unmasked that the U.S. High Command, with its vast experience in large-scale combat missions in Southeast Asia, recognized the inevitability of suffering significant civilian casualties when carrying out extensive deployments in densely populated areas such as the Delta. In this way, it was established that the majority of soldiers were sent to Vietnam, nothing more than to become cold-blooded killers who mowed down entire populations of innocent civilians. Survivors of a massacre by U.S. Marines in Quang Tri Province recounted what it meant to huddle in an underground bomb shelter as gunshots and grenade explosions echoed above. In addition to the fear of the situation, there was also the anguish of knowing that some of their relatives were being murdered above their heads. Many of the soldiers involved in these combat crimes faced a court-martial back in the United States. The military did not want to draw attention to the atrocities committed in Vietnam, so most were acquitted of murder charges. This generated administrative peace in the ranks of the army, but left the troops with an enormous and sinister burden of conscience.
I didn't give a fuck who he was. I was trying to keep me alive. It wasn't me and a Vietnamese. It was me and anybody that's got to get, oh man, this is hard.
In the tense calm of the years after the Vietnam War, a silent battalion of survivors emerged, carrying an invisible but overwhelming weight called post-traumatic stress syndrome. American soldiers who returned home carried with them the deep scars of a war that was fought not only on the battlefields, but also in the shadows of their minds. Those inexperienced young men became bloodthirsty men in the midst of the chaotic battle. The price to pay was enduring a countless series of internal and invisible specters that would haunt them long after the echoes of the gunshots faded. At night, the sound of a crunch could transport them back to the jungle, where the darkness was tinged with danger. The distant explosions recalled not only the fury of the cannons, but also the deafening roar of emotional anguish. They could also be assaulted by Dantesque nightmares, starring the innocent civilians they had murdered, or their companions killed in the middle of the jungle. Every step in everyday life, every sound or image, immediately transported these veterans to the battlefield. Life was unbearable when seemingly harmless stimuli triggered traumatic memories. How does one regain peace of mind when he feels like he is a prisoner of war in his own mind? Fighting PTSD is not simply a matter of getting over the past. It is an ongoing war in which soldiers return to the trenches, every time they close their eyes. The guilt of the bloody crimes committed is a fuel that feeds this condition. There is no uniform that can be hung in the closet to leave behind the weight of memories. Instead of shiny medals, they carry the shadows of what they saw and experienced, of what was done and what was not avoided.
If there's a hell, that's probably what it smells like there. It penetrates you and it just won't go away for a long time. It's horrible.
It is crucial to remember that behind every battle-hardened face there is a story worth telling. In the daily struggle of these warriors lies the true epic of human resilience. In each case, there will be those who think that the trauma is deserved, while in others, it will be understood that it is a tragic consequence of forcing a young person to kill. Although the war may be officially over, the battle against PTSD continues for those who carried the weight of the nation on their shoulders, as well as the blood of innocent people on their hands. This is how we are finishing today's video. We thank you for reaching the end, and we look forward to seeing you in the next installments of Military History.